Just a quick disclaimer at the top of the show. In the following video, I will be using the terms Native American, Native, Indigenous, and Indian somewhat interchangeably, guided at times by a desire to use the terminology most contextually appropriate for the purposes of historical grounding. No Indigenous peoples of what is today Canada are directly addressed, so you won't hear First Nations at any point. No disrespect was intended by any of my language choices, and I'm always grateful for feedback in this area. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Resonant Time, a show about spotlighting the fascinating human dramas to be found within the most riveting moments of history. My name is Cam. Episode 3, Tecumseh and the Shawnee, a warrior's name and a people's fight for self-determination. The following episode is part 1 of a 2-part series on the Shawnee people of North America, their centuries-long struggle to preserve their sovereign existence, and the rise and fall of their visionary leader, Tecumseh. I'll soon delve into the history of the Shawnee and follow them over generations of resistance and perseverance in the face of onrushing cultural and geographical displacement. But what actually brought me to this topic at the very outset was something far simpler. A name. William Tecumseh Sherman is a name resonant to any student of the American Civil War. A general best known perhaps for his devastating March to the Sea, an 1864 campaign that saw Union forces under his command cut a massive, fiery path through Georgia, destroying anything and everything that could aid the Confederate war effort, bringing war home to the Southern civilian, and in many respects, first establishing the notion of total war in its modern incarnation, a legacy the 20th century would take to logical and very illogical extremes. Whether one sees Sherman as a ruthless villain, as much of the South still does, or a capable leader willing to make hard, callous decisions well suited to addressing very hard times, he exited the Civil War a living military icon. Sherman's Civil War tenure, however, is not the part of his life I sought to highlight in opening this series. By the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War, the South was at least on paper vanquished, pacified, and in the beginning stages of being reintegrated into the United States proper. As a sidebar, perhaps see my very first episode of this show, rough as it is, on Ulysses S. Grant and Civil War Reconstruction to see just how successful the post-Civil War reforms imposed upon the South proved to be. But in any case, attentions could now be turned westward to the portions of the country still only under marginal U.S. control, the vast tracts of open country from the Great Plains to essentially California, sparsely populated by white settlement and in many places still dominated by mighty tribes of native peoples such as the Lakota and the Comanche, their horse mastery and wide-ranging buffalo hunting making increasingly emphasized post-war endeavors like gold-seeking and railroad laying more hazardous and fraught than Washington desired. Following the Civil War's conclusion in 1865, military force could once more be put towards furthering this end, and Sherman was promoted to the position of divisional commander of what was then very much bleeding-edge Western territory, the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. And this role essentially then put him in command of an enormous percentage of the century's many remaining battles with, and land seizures from, Native Americans. His ensuing legacy would not rank him as a friend to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, bringing as he did his scorched earth policies previously wrought upon the rebellious South to the Great Plains, decimating the buffalo to hasten the end of the nomadic way of life, and not infrequently encouraging genocidal practice, both culturally and regarding the physical lives of native peoples. Sherman massively contributed to what was increasingly evident as being an inevitability, a decisive end to Native America as it was. Many formerly proud, independent native peoples would, by the end of this era and century, be essentially relegated to reservations, where they awaited government handouts to survive, their former lifestyle and conception of their own world gone, never to return save in surviving cultural memory. Native America was, obviously and thankfully, not eradicated completely, and sometimes this is overstated erroneously, but the weight of U.S. military intervention and civilian expansion had reshaped it to fit within a white American conceptualization, and the preservation of the true customs and lifeways took conscious effort. You may by this point be asking why I've spent so much time already talking about William Sherman and a time period completely separate from the one I promised to cover from the outset. Well, the key lies in that just now unspoken middle name, Tecumseh. Tecumseh, the middle name given to a white man who would go on to do more to contribute to the annihilation of Native America than most of his own equally zealous contemporaries, was in fact the name first given to another famous, if slightly less famous today, individual from another era, one whose aims couldn't have been further from William Sherman's. The name, bestowed upon Sherman as a strong name, an almost prescient evocation of a brave, independent warrior who would achieve great things in the estimation of his own people, was felt to carry such magnitudes because it first belonged to just such an indigenous man to embody these qualities. And while invoking Indian liberation was far from supported, much less admired, by white Americans of Sherman's day, This indigenous man's name carried such power that it was granted to a child no doubt in hopes of channeling that might, far removed from its original context and purpose. But that man's great deeds would echo through the ages and across cultures, achieving as he did to unite a pan-Indian resistance against the encroachment and privations of white settlement, European and American, and to spark a movement that would perhaps come closest to delivering a truly free native nation, encompassing as it did many tribes from far-reaching points of North America. Deeds so admired even by his enemies, and all the more lionized and revered no doubt for their doomed heroism and ultimate failure, that eventually his name would embed itself between the first and last names of the man who would go on to be the scourge of the Southerner and Native American alike. Is this just? What ownership is there exactly to a name, unspoken or otherwise? What if a future, quite famous or infamous namesake goes dramatically against the well-known purposes of the original bearer? Is it but one last indignity to eclipse the original bearer's fame and hijack their namesake's associations? That is the strange historical quandary given us by the case of Tecumseh and William Tecumseh Sherman, which first inspired this series. I soon learned, however, that there was far, far more to be said about Tecumseh and the Shawnee people from which he hailed. Without further ado, let's get into it. The Shawnee tribe ancestrally lived primarily in the Ohio River Valley, in addition to a few neighboring modern U.S. states. Speaking Algonquin, they were driven from their homelands by the Iroquois, scattering and settling in disparate places including Illinois and the American Southeast, but by around 1730 they'd mostly reunited in the Ohio River Valley once more. Their tribal life from this point on would be sadly defined by border conflict and land disputes with encroaching white settlers, first the British, then the Americans. Several battles and resulting treaties would then play out over the next 70-odd years, none resulting in favorable outcomes for the Shawnee themselves. The French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War as it was known in Europe, saw different Native American tribes back different European competitors, with some supporting the British, others the French. Its conclusion in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris saw France lose most of its North American territory, at least east of the Mississippi. But perhaps the more seismic change was felt by the Native Americans, whose skillful employment of the tactic of playing the French and British off of each other was now impossible, with one relevant player now essentially out of the picture. The British were increasingly disinterested at this time to fund a large military contingent in the American colonies, and their attempts to enforce a functional border between said colonies and indigenous lands backfired, creating the conflicts that defined the next century of U.S. Native relations as Americans eager for new lands to plunder flowed west. The Treaty of Paris would ultimately leave the American colonies and the British so at odds over policy that it effectively set the stage for the upcoming American Revolution. Coming on the heels of Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British came into possession of formerly French and Spanish territories, and in turn the native peoples which those lands included. Acquiring lands from modern-day Canada down through the Great Lakes region of what is now the American Midwest, and including the very recently Spanish Florida, the British now had many additional responsibilities insofar as determining how to view and treat the indigenous populations, to recognize some degree of sovereignty, or to subjugate these individuals as another spoil of empire. Complex alliance systems were thus inherited by the British, who would soon blunder catastrophically under British Governor-General in North America, Geoffrey Amherst. In his own words, Amherst believed the natives to be the vilest race of beings that ever infested the earth, himself being fully convinced the only true method of treating those Indians is to keep them in a proper subjection. Amherst would arrogantly and short-sightedly muck things further by ending the policy of gift exchange with native peoples, an absolutely essential component of diplomacy and trust building. He deemed it a wasteful expenditure, though he would now lose far more. In response to this and other encroachments and slights by the British, native tribes of the Great Lakes region united in a then essentially unprecedented alliance against the empire at their doorstep. Thus, the Ottawa, Delaware, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Mingo, or Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, Huron, Choctaw, Piankashaw, Kickapoo, Tunica, Peoria, and Mascoutin joined forces. Concurrently, a prophet from the Delaware tribe named Neolin experienced visions from the Great Spirit or Master of Life, painting a vivid picture of a post-European North America free from settlers, alcohol, and missionaries. This would not be the last time a messianic visionary, fusing indigenous spirituality with echoes of Christianity, would encourage his compatriots and followers to unite in the pursuit of a return to bygone pre-colonial times. Tecumseh himself, as we'll eventually see, would very much be at the center of one of these dynamics. In May of 1763, the United Tribes began their resistance, known to history as Pontiac's Rebellion, in honor of its leader and principal organizer, Chief Pontiac of the Odawa tribe, swiftly taking British fortifications from what is today Wisconsin all the way to western Pennsylvania. By surrounding and besieging these isolated forts, often lonely outposts of a largely unestablished British Empire in America, the natives won many victories until a mere 3 outstanding forts remained: Niagara, Detroit, and Pitt. The British didn't display particular haste in relieving these sieges and struggled to best the indigenous alliance once they did. Finally, in 1765, with an unfulfilled promise of French backing and a pledge from the British to acknowledge native sovereignty and honor their alliances, a treaty brought the conflict to its conclusion. While the victory brought newfound respect and recognition from colonizers regarding native nations, as well as an extremely successful modeling of what unified joint military and political action could achieve for them, the win also regrettably set Native Americans on an even worse path with the American settlers, who as frontier residents had suffered native violence at a far worse proportion compared to the British themselves. The British would attempt to maintain their policies towards the natives, at the perceived expense of the Americans, and this would all further taint relations as the Revolutionary War barreled ever closer. A new treaty, proposed in 1768 and known as the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, again attempted to address the untenably muddled pressure cooker that was the boundary line between indigenous nations and the avaricious American colonists, but it stumbled broadly in failing to resolve the quagmire in any remotely lasting way, and specifically in the bad blood it fostered by relegating tribes directly implicated and disadvantaged by territorial loss, such as the Shawnee and Delaware, to positions as essentially present observers rather than signatories. The Six Nations of New York, also known as the Iroquois, essentially gave away the Ohio homeland of other tribes to ease pressures in their own regions of New York and Pennsylvania. This would set the stage for further turmoil and violence soon to come. On January 1st, 1774, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, and acting as Royal Governor of Virginia, ordered the area of Pittsburgh to be declared as part of Virginia's Augusta County, advantageously positioned as it was at the spot the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers join to form the Ohio River. Having never accepted the term ceding their lands, this having been effectively decided for them, the Shawnee viewed the increasingly aggressive expansion of the Virginia colony into their well-stocked Kentucky hunting grounds as a perfect pretext for a decisive clash. As warning signs of an imminent Shawnee attack intensified, Dunmore ordered county militias to be put at the ready, lacking the funding for a real standing military body. A sequence of massacres and reprisals culminated in the pitched Battle of Point Pleasant, a very near-run thing, which reflected well on the brave forces of the Shawnee fighting under their commander, Hokulesqua, or Cornstalk, as well as on their Mingo and Delaware allies. Unable to rout the colonial forces, however, both sides agreed to terms in the so-called Treaty of Camp Charlotte, in theory settling more land rights and fixing set boundaries for both parties, but it should come as absolutely no surprise to hear that this would not stick and counted for little ultimately. Interestingly, Dunmore's legacy would be complicated by the tendency of some Americans to look upon his war as the first action of the American Revolution, and his well-established hardline loyalty to the Crown, manifesting in his later orders to shell Norfolk, Virginia, and to actively work against Patriot interests, would even lead some to suspect his true intentions in his dealings with the Shawnee, alleging he had aimed to ally himself with native factions to quash colonial forces and their territorial ambitions, effectively distracting the fledgling Americans from their aim of nationhood. In 1775, Dunmore would issue a proclamation that offered full emancipation to any slaves or indentured servants willing to desert to the Loyalist cause in the course of the American Revolutionary War, a rather compelling offer, and a tactic societies clinging to the barbarism of slavery would rightly have pitted against them, not infrequently going forward. Quite embarrassingly to posterity, Dunmore's proclamation would lead former friend George Washington to address him as that arch traitor to the rights of humanity. Upon fleeing the continent, Dunmore would eventually be governor of the Bahamas. Unable to play the American colonists, now upstart revolutionaries, and their British overlords off quite so easily, lines were fairly firmly drawn in the sand following the outbreak of the American Revolution and its ensuing war. Which tribes sided with whom varied amongst the indigenous nations, but the Shawnee backed the British, a platform very understandable with hindsight and more popular in the moment. The British were at least proposing to adhere to land rights and control of white population growth. On the other hand, victory of the onrushing American rebels represented a far more dire outcome for Native America, and that outcome came to pass following Britain's eventual defeat in 1783. Following said defeat, as outlined in the Treaty of Paris at the war's conclusion, Britain ceded an enormous chunk of North America, south of the Great Lakes, north of the Ohio River, and west of Pennsylvania, typically known as the Northwest Territory, to the victorious United States. This landmass is effectively represented by the present-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. Broke following the resolution of their expensive revolt and war, and unable to even tax the American population at this time, the young U.S. hoped to raise funds by selling newly acquired land from this region to prospective settlers. The indigenous nations occupying these new lands were primarily former allies of Great Britain, a paternal benefactor no longer capable of meaningfully safeguarding their interests. Ironically, the Americans recognized the land holdings of these tribes, but that very recognition would be weaponized. By acknowledging their territorial lands, the Americans could firmly place the holdings of the respective tribes, all recently allied with Great Britain against the U.S., under the banner of Great Britain's now ceded territory. Having been victorious in war, the Americans now saw themselves fully correct in interpreting these and any other British claims and possessions regarding the Northwest Territory as forfeit and void. The preeminent native tribes of this vast territory, the Wyandot or Huron, Miami, Shawnee, Lenape or Delaware, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Kaskaskia, and the Wabash Confederacy would unite to better resist the encroaching Americans, forming the United Indian Nations in 1785, wisely understanding that division and treating with the U.S. individually spelled certain disaster, and putting forth a united bulwark to safeguard their shared interests. However, in January of 1786, the Shawnee, Delaware, and Wyandot signed the Treaty of Fort Finney, which opened the door for American settlement along those tribes' territories on the Ohio River. This broke ranks and diverged from the greater objectives and interests of the UIN, and the treaty was rejected by that formal body, but the damage was done, and Americans exploited this division. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 officially incorporated the Northwest Territory, and peace was initially hoped for within its boundaries, but 2 years later, in 1789, things had broken down, and violence was heavily impacting both indigenous tribes and white settlers. The U.S. could now finally organize a standing army, with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, but in ways nearly identical to the struggles of their British forerunners, resources were simply stretched too thinly to accomplish the many objectives necessary to ensure stability and peace in the West. Unable to mount sufficient forces to ensure treaty compliance, occupy and defend forts, protect settlers from Indian raids, or to pose any sort of buffer against the white militias of the frontier raiding into Indian lands, the young U.S. government was supremely hamstrung in attempting to navigate this incredibly sensitive situation, even had the will for fair dealing been there to begin with. Hearing word from his subordinates close to the action that the Indians of the region were inclined to war, in 1790, America's first president, George Washington, ordered a punitive expedition to be staged against the Miami and Shawnee, specifically believing the best defense was a decisive offense. In addition to ostensibly bringing about a peaceful frontier through the military action and ensuing subjugation of the natives, another key objective of the American forces was to destroy any British trading posts found behind enemy lines. Even having been militarily defeated and forced out of much of their former North American colonies, the British continued to trade with and supply their former native allies, in addition to maintaining much territory beyond the relinquished 13 colonies. The Americans hoped to effectively force these tribes to trade with them exclusively, buying American-made goods and essentially embracing this new post-British North America, irrespective of the bloody conflict these Americans were forcing upon them now. Expelling the British from still-occupied Fort Detroit remained a compelling objective as well. Two separate, independently commanded forces of Americans now set out, burning native villages and primarily moving towards the Miami capital of Kikionga. The Americans saw mixed results, suffering from poor-quality mercenaries paid for as replacements by better-suited would-be soldiers, citizens who opted to remain on their farms, the harvest coinciding with the campaign. Morale was often quite poor, and some American leadership was quite wanting, notably from well-known drunkard Lieutenant Colonel Josiah Harmer. Opposing the Americans, the more impressive showing from War Chiefs Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, of the Miami and Shawnee respectively, marshaled well their 1,000 warriors and waited for the right moment to strike. Blue Jacket, whose chosen adult name was actually Weapersonwa, meaning whirlpool, was born by most accounts sometime between 1738 and 1743. His life, not surprisingly, isn't well documented prior to his 30s, the same time frame he would rise to prominence as a war chief, but he stood as a significant and influential Shawnee leader, and an important predecessor to Tecumseh, who himself, as a young man, would serve as a scout in the coming conflicts with the Americans. Strangely, a legend grew up in the years following Blue Jacket's death that he was actually a white man, kidnapped as a child and raised among the Shawnee. Specifically, the story went that his identity was really Marmaduke von Swearingen, a conflation likely made as Marmaduke was himself an actual white man who lived amongst the Shawnee, The story goes that Marmaduke and his younger brother were to be abducted by a party of Shawnee while out roaming near their family's homestead. Marmaduke, then 17, offered to join the Shawnee voluntarily if his little brother would be released. Marmaduke allegedly then became quite well adapted to Shawnee life and thrived in their society, opting not to return to his prior life among his white family. This rumor surrounding Blue Jacket's true identity persisted in some form or another until at least as recently as the 1960s, and to slightly editorialize, it seems likely another instance of white society refusing to credit brilliance among non-whites as organic and natural. Surely this gifted war leader could not have been native. Besides the presence of existing historical inconsistencies, this ongoing uncertainty was finally put to rest by DNA analysis in the 21st century. The Indians took full advantage of Lieutenant Colonel Harmer's poor leadership and seized several opportunities to strike the Americans as their forces divided, luring scouting parties into ambushes. Too cowardly, inebriated, and incompetent to join battle even when a possible success was at hand, Harmer abandoned his subordinate Colonel John Hardin and his forces as they engaged Blue Jacket and Little Turtle at Kikionga, leading to massive losses for the Americans. Over the 3 days culminating in that defeat at Kikionga, the Americans had lost well over 100 men killed, and that final defeat would itself gain infamy as the worst defeat of U.S. forces at the hands of indigenous opponents up to that time, and would ultimately stand as the third worst such defeat in American history, topped only by Custer's annihilation at the Little Bighorn in 1876 and the near-future 1791 Battle of the Wabash. Morbidly, the Indians named this victory at Kikionga the Battle of the Pumpkin Fields, because as dawn broke over the battlefield on that crisp late October day, exposing the mutilated corpses of the unrecovered American dead, their scalped heads were said to resemble squash, steaming in the cool morning air. Now in 1791, Washington again demanded action in the ongoing conflict in the Northwest. Arthur St. Clair, governor of the Northwest Territory, was to lead a punitive force against the recently victorious forces of the Native Confederacy. Again suffering from extremely poorly disciplined and trained soldiers, with many deserting outright, St. Clair blundered into an even more catastrophic defeat than that suffered at the Battle of the Pumpkin Fields. Camped along the Wabash River, the Americans took no precautions regarding defensive perimeters, and were thus annihilated at dawn, suffering more than 630 dead, with 264 wounded, an astounding and record-holding casualty rate of 97%, unmatched in U.S. history. The native forces lost just 21 men, with about twice that injured. Finally getting truly serious, Washington would put in place a man actually capable of meeting his war aims. Major General Mad Anthony Wayne, so named for his emotional volatility as well as his hardline approach to troop discipline. Wayne had been a notable hero of the U.S. Revolutionary War. Setting forth with competent, ready troops, Wayne would emerge victorious in the 1794 Battle of Fallen Timbers, set in present-day Ohio and so named for the tree-trunk-strewn landscape of the battlefield, a tornado having recently passed through. Victory in this battle closed out the Northwest Indian War, and 1 year later, in August of 1795, the Treaty of Greenville was signed, forcing the Native Confederacy to surrender lands south and east of the titular Greenville Line, which served, as always, in theory, as the boundary line between U.S. and Native territories. Losing swaths of land including much of Ohio, and parts of Indiana, the treaty, just as seemingly all such treaties, settled next to nothing and was almost immediately defied, violently as always. In the wake of the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Shawnee, having been forced to give up their lands in Ohio, relocated farther west into Indiana, but as certain as death and taxes, so long as more physical land, occupied or otherwise, existed, border disputes and violence would follow. The Americans once more, and far from the last time, pushed west. When we next reconvene, the adult legacy of the young scout we last met serving under Blue Jacket and the desperate struggles against American envelopment will finally unfurl, as Tecumseh, now a grown man, strides onto center stage of North American indigenous resistance history. Thanks for watching.